Ever been in a situation, maybe you're living with someone, a partner, a family member, whoever, and that like initial spark
Yeah.
is just gone,
Yeah.
like not even a flicker, just totally out. And it makes you wonder, like, can you even have a happy home if it's not built on romantic love?
It's a good question.
So that's what we're tackling in today's deep dive. Can you actually share a space without love?
It's something a lot more people are dealing with than you might think.
Yeah, and it's not always a bad thing.
Definitely not.
We're looking at this podcast called Love versus Coexistence. It's all about this whole idea. They talk to people who are actually making it work
Interesting.
and break down what it takes to thrive when you're really just coexisting. So think of this deep dive as like your cheat sheet to figure out,
I like that's it.
is coexistence even a good idea? And if it is, how do you avoid those pitfalls?
Giving you the tools to really look at your own situation
Yes.
and make good decisions about your relationships.
Okay, so first things first. What exactly is coexistence? The podcast defines it as sharing a space,
Okay.
managing routines, maybe even having some level of friendship, but without that romantic love or deep emotional connection.
And that's where it gets really interesting. They don't see this as like a black and white thing.
Okay.
They describe it more as a spectrum of emotional distance. Like you might be coexisting with an ex, maybe there's some tension there, or with a family member where it's more, functional and loving. So each situation has its own dynamics.
That makes sense. When I first heard coexistence, I was picturing like something pretty negative, like two people barely tolerating each other.
Yeah.
But the podcast points out that it can be really positive, even intentional sometimes. They talk about couples who've drifted apart but stay together because it makes sense practically.
Yeah.
Finances, the kids.
It's about making the most of a tough spot.
Yeah.
And it can bring stability and support.
And they also had examples of like platonic roommates, friends or acquaintances sharing a space. No romance involved.
Super common, especially in cities where the cost of living is so high.
Oh, for sure.
So it becomes this like practical solution that also gives you companionship, that sense of community.
And then, of course, there's living with family.
Right.
Maybe out of necessity, even if the relationship isn't great.
Sometimes it's actually a chance to heal those bonds.
Okay, so we're seeing coexistence isn't always bad.
Nope.
Sometimes it's a choice. Sometimes it's just what happens.
Yeah.
But what about the pros and cons? The podcast was actually pretty positive about the upsides. Financial stability being a big one.
Especially for couples choosing to stay together for practical reasons. And we can't forget the companionship. Even without romantic love, just having someone to share a meal with, watch a movie with, just chat with at the end of the day. That's really valuable.
For sure. And in some cases, like with those platonic roommates, it can even lead to deeper friendships, a sense of community, but it's not always perfect.
Right. The podcast keeps it real about the downsides, too.
What are some of those red flags to look out for?
Well, one of the big ones is the potential for loneliness or even resentment. Even if things seem okay on the surface, that lack of a deep emotional connection can really take its toll over time.
Especially if, like, one person is secretly hoping for more, right? Like you're coexisting with an ex.
Oh, yeah.
But you still have those feelings.
Yeah.
That's got to be a recipe for trouble.
Absolutely. And even if there's no romantic thing going on, a mismatch in expectations can be a huge source of conflict. Maybe one person really wants that closeness, that emotional support, but the other person just can't or don't give it.
So communication is key.
It's everything.
It seems like that open, honest communication is the foundation.
Totally agree. You have to be able to talk openly and honestly about your needs, your boundaries, what you expect from this whole arrangement.
And that's where those real-life stories from the podcast get so interesting. They give us a glimpse into how real people are doing this, making it work.
They offer some really great insights.
I want to hear what worked for them, what they struggled with.
Let's dive in and see what we can learn. One of the stories that really grabbed my attention was about this woman, Lisa, who was actually coexisting with her ex-husband.
Wow, okay, that's got to be tough. What was their situation?
They had been married for like 10 years, had 2 little kids, then they decided to split. But they owned a house together, and neither of them could afford to move out.
Right.
So they decided to just keep living together as roommates, at least until they could figure something else out.
I can only imagine what an emotional roller coaster that must have been. Did it work?
It wasn't easy, but they did manage to create a pretty stable, functional, coexisting situation.
Okay.
And one of the big things that helped was that they were both totally committed to putting their kids first.
That makes sense. When you add kids into the mix,
Yeah,
it has a whole other layer.
absolutely.
More complex.
In Lisa's case, she and her ex, they really tried to present a united front for the kids. Even though they weren't together anymore, they set clear boundaries about their roles as parents and roommates and made sure they were communicating openly and respectfully.
So communication and that shared commitment to their children.
Big time.
Those were the cornerstones.
Yeah.
But did they ever struggle with, like,
Oh, for sure.
old romantic feelings resurfacing?
Lisa was actually really honest about that in the interview. She said there were definitely times when she missed the intimacy, the companionship of their marriage, even wondered if they made a mistake.
It's so normal
It is.
to grieve a relationship,
Totally.
even if you're the one who ended it.
Exactly. You have to acknowledge those feelings, give yourself time to heal. But Lisa realized that dwelling on the past wasn't helping, especially not the kids.
No.
So she focused on the good parts of her new situation.
What were some of those good parts?
Well, for one, they could both stay involved in their kids' lives without having to deal with custody schedules and all that.
Yeah.
Plus, splitting those household chores, the childcare, it gave them both more time for themselves.
Oh, that's nice.
Their own interests.
So they actually found a way to have a more balanced life within this coexisting arrangement.
That's the thing. Even in what seems like a really tough situation, there can be these unexpected benefits, opportunities for growth.
I love that.
This story really shows how putting those practical things in place, the boundaries, open communication, it helps you deal with the emotional stuff.
Did the podcast have any other examples of that?
Definitely. There was another story about these two friends, Mark and Sarah, who'd been living together platonically for years.
Okay, so no romantic history.
Nope.
Maybe that makes things simpler.
You'd think so, right? But they had their own set of challenges. They'd always been super close, supportive friends. But over time, Sarah started to develop feelings for Mark.
Ooh, how'd that go? Did she tell him?
She did, and to her surprise, he admitted he'd been feeling the same way.
Oh, wow.
But had been too scared to say anything.
So what happened next? Did they try dating?
They did, but it didn't really work out the way they hoped.
Oh, no.
They realized that their friendship dynamic was very different from a romantic one.
So the spark was there.
Yeah.
But the compatibility.
Not so much. They had different ways of communicating, different expectations about intimacy, different ideas about the future.
It's like they had all the right ingredients.
I know.
But couldn't make it work.
They had a bunch of conversations, some tough ones, about their feelings.
That open communication again.
It always comes back to that.
Right.
And for them, it led to the decision to go back to just being friends.
So they chose coexistence over romance.
They did. And they said it wasn't easy. They both had to, let go of that potential relationship.
It takes a lot of maturity to do that.
It really does. But they realized their friendship was too important to risk.
I love that. They salvaged the friendship.
They did. It shows how strong their bond was. They put the friendship above the maybe temporary romance.
These stories are so interesting. They show how complicated coexisting relationships can be.
Yeah.
And how important it is to communicate, set those boundaries, be willing to adapt as things change.
They really offer some great lessons.
I'm ready to dive into those lessons.
Let's do it.
Can you break down some of the key takeaways?
For sure.
From the stories and the podcast overall? Okay, so we've heard these examples of coexistence, good and bad. What if someone's listening and thinking, hey, maybe this could work for me? What are the big things to keep in mind?
Well, the podcast really stresses this. You got to know your why. Like, why even consider this? What are you hoping to get out of it?
Yeah.
Or avoid by coexisting with this person?
Because if you just kind of drift into it without a purpose, it could easily backfire.
Exactly. Are you after financial stability, companionship, maybe a way to ease out of a romance more slowly? Once you've got that clarity, then you can start talking, really talking.
And those aren't always easy conversations, right? The guests on the podcast were pretty open about how awkward those first talks can be.
Oh, totally. Takes guts to put everything out there.
Yeah.
But those early conversations are like the foundation of the whole thing. You've got to talk about what you need, your boundaries, what you absolutely will not put up with.
Right.
And even what you hope this will look like down the road.
So it's not just practical stuff like bills and chores.
No, it's deeper than that.
It's getting on the same page emotionally.
Yeah.
Did they have any tips on how to have those conversations well?
They did. They recommend using I statements. That way you express what you need and feel without blaming the other person.
Okay.
So instead of saying, you never do chores,
Right.
you could say, I feel overwhelmed when I'm the only one doing chores.
Oh, that's good. It's not about blame. It's more like,
Working together.
yeah. What other communication tips did they have?
Active listening, that's huge. Really trying to get where the other person is coming from, even if you disagree. And don't be afraid to ask questions to make sure you're both understanding each other.
It's not just talking, it's hearing.
Exactly. And it's not a one-time thing.
Right.
As your lives change, what you need changes. You've got to be able to talk about it again.
This is sounding a lot like a good romantic relationship. Clear communication, boundaries,
Yeah.
being willing to adapt.
And that's the thing. Whether it's a partner, family, a roommate, successful coexistence takes those same skills as any healthy relationship.
So maybe this deep dive isn't just about coexistence.
Right.
It's about making our relationships better overall.
I think you're right. Now, besides communication, the podcast also talked a lot about boundaries.
Oh, yeah. Boundaries, boundaries, boundaries.
Yeah.
What does that actually mean when you're coexisting?
It starts with being honest with yourself about what you need to feel okay, to feel respected. Do you need your own space? Are there times you need quiet? Can you only give so much emotional support?
Okay, once you know that about yourself, how do you tell the other person?
Straight up, but kindly. Like, I really like our time together, but I need some alone time each day to recharge. Could I have the evenings to myself?
I like that. It's direct, but not mean or demanding.
Yeah, it's about finding what works for both of you. And remember, boundaries aren't about controlling someone else. They're about taking care of yourself.
Which is important in any relationship, but especially when you're coexisting and things can get blurry.
Exactly. Now, on top of communication and boundaries, the podcast also talked about being flexible.
Oh, yeah.
Life happens, right? Jobs, people get sick, unexpected bills.
So even with the best plans, you got to be ready for things to change.
Right. Be willing to talk things over again if you need to. And it's okay to say no sometimes. You don't have to be everything for everyone.
Finding that balance between being there for someone, but also not losing yourself.
Yes. No, one last thing that really stuck with me. The podcast challenged us to think beyond just romantic love
Okay.
and see the other kinds of love that can exist in coexistence.
So instead of what's missing,
Focus on what's there.
I like that.
Like maybe it's the love between siblings helping each other out, or close friends who always have each other's back.
That's nice. It reminds us that love comes in lots of forms.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes those relationships that don't fit a neat box are the best ones.
So as you think about your own relationships and whether coexistence could work, remember, love isn't always about those big moments.
Fair bye.
Sometimes it's about the quiet stuff, being there for each other, knowing you're not alone in life's ups and downs.
That's powerful stuff, whether we're coexisting, dating, or just trying to figure out this whole relationship thing.
Totally agree. It's about finding connection and support, whatever that looks like for you.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into coexistence without love. We covered a lot. But hopefully you've gotten some good ideas, practical tips.
Keep thinking about this topic. Think about your own experiences with coexistence.
Yeah.
What really hit home for you? What felt challenging?
And most importantly, how can you use what we talked about to build better, more genuine relationships in your own life?
Until next time, keep exploring those human connections. You might be surprised by what you find.